We're going to take a look at how arrays work in the Java programming language. Now, I'm assuming by now that you already understand what arrays are in a general sense. So if you don't, if you haven't watched it yet, go watch the video that is an introduction to arrays. The other thing to be aware of is that pretty much every programming language has arrays, going back to the earliest programming languages that were ever invented. So whatever you're using probably has arrays in some form, but it might be a little different than Java. Java uses the C-based syntax. So in other words, Java in general is based on the C programming language. So there's a good chance that whatever language you're using is close to this. But if you're not using Java, you should probably go find a resource that is specific to your language. With that, all that said, let's go ahead and jump into VS Code and try this out in Java. In that first video, I used this example of a team where we want to keep track of the names of a handful of players, 6 or 7 players. And I've started to write some code to do that without arrays. And so the first player is John. And now if I want to keep track of another name, I have to make a new string variable for that. So that's player 2, and that's Marie. And if you're just working with a small number of strings in this case, just a handful of pieces of data, then doing it with individual variables is not that big a deal. If it's a pickleball team or something like that, no big deal. But what if it's a football team and now we have at least 22 variables that we're going to have to keep track of, and maybe even more than that if we have subs and things like that. Very quickly this starts to get unwieldy, right? It starts to become a real pain to deal with all these separate variables. And that's where arrays come in. So if I want to declare an array is a variable just like anything else. And so if it's an array of strings in this case, I'm going to start out by saying string, and now I need an identifier. So the identifier, or the name of this variable, should reflect that it's really plural. So if we're going to have, if we're going to go from player to a group of players, then players is probably a good name for that. And that we often use that for our array names, is just adding S onto whatever we're keeping track of. But team is also good because it's the idea of a group of players as well. And it makes it clear in my code that when I refer to team, I'm talking about the whole group, not just an individual. So this creates a string called team. That's what we've been doing all along. If we want to make this a variable, the syntax that we add are these square brackets. And we have to start being careful now because we've got curly braces for code blocks, we've got parentheses for methods, and now we're adding on these square brackets, which are kind of above your return or enter key on the top right part of your keyboard. That is always going to represent or refer to an array in the Java programming language. So anytime you see square brackets, we're talking about an array. Now, what's interesting here is this sort of looks familiar. It's a little bit of deja vu because I've got a similar chunk of code right here. Our main method, where we begin our sort of entry point for a Java program, takes as an argument an array of strings. The reason for that has to do with command line arguments, and we're not going to get into that here, but I just want to point out that, okay, we've seen this before. Now we're starting to understand the rest of this, this first line of code we ever wrote that's a big pain in the neck. So the square brackets in this case indicate that team is going to be an array of strings. And this line of code really just declares that variable and doesn't do anything with it. It just sort of identifies the name. To make this useful, we really have to specify the size. And so we're going to use an assignment statement. In Java, arrays are objects. And so whenever we make a new object in Java, we have to use the keyword new. And so we're going to say, what do we want? We want a new string array that holds, and then we've got those brackets again. But inside this second set of brackets, that's where we put the length of the array. In other words, the number of elements we want to have. And so I've got on my team here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. My length is 6. That means I'm going to put 6 right there. Okay. That line of code now is going to declare the name team as pointing to an array of strings. It's going to create that array of strings big enough for 6 individual strings. This array is not very useful at the moment because it's essentially empty. It's filled with a bunch of empty strings. Essentially, they're going to be null pointers in this case. So to make it useful, we got to start putting some data into there. The way that we refer to an individual element in an array is with this kind of subscript syntax. I'm going to say team, and now my square brackets. And inside the square brackets, I put the element that I'm referring to. And so if we look up here at my code comment, we start numbering at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I missed my cursor there, but I counted correctly. Remember that the last element is always the length of the array minus 1. So the length here is 6. That's what I specified. That means my valid index numbers are going to go from 0 to 5. So let's say team index 0 equals John. Let's say team index 1 equals Marie. Oops, I got to put that in quotation marks. Marie. And then before we get too far, let's just test that and see how this works. So I'm going to say system out println team 0, system out println team 1. Fix my typo. And let's go ahead and run this. So John and Marie. Well, this code works, but it's turning me into a liar. I said the whole point of this was to not have to deal with these variables individually. And that's where we're headed with arrays, but we have to get there first. And so you gotta trust me for a few minutes here until we get to that point. But I want to pause to talk about this idea of accessing arrays with these index numbers. So remember, the valid indexes go from 0 to the length minus 1, which is 5 in this case. And those index numbers can refer to any of those elements. If I refer to, for example, 3, it's hard to remember this when you're first starting out. That's not the third element in the array because we started at 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, that's actually the fourth one. So if I run that, I should get David. Oh, I don't get David because I didn't assign anything to element number 3. So when we declare an array of objects, and a string is an object, until we put something there, we get something that in Java is called a null pointer. So it just says the word null, null meaning kind of nothingness, right? So if I want to refer to element 3, I've got to assign that. Now, I don't want to spend time assigning all these right now, because what I really want to show is what if we try to do what a lot of students do and say, well, I want the last one. I want the last name in there. That's there are 6, so that must be element 6. Well, let's try that. We have gotten an error. It is an exception. We call these errors exceptions in Java. Array index out of bounds exception. So the boundaries, I keep repeating it because it's important, the boundaries for these index numbers are 0 and the length minus 1. If I try and refer to an index outside of that range, that's out of bounds. The program is going to, well, for now it's going to crash. We'll learn later in our programming lives how to gracefully deal with that. But for now, we just crash our program and we grind to a halt. So it's really important to use these index numbers carefully and to be aware of whether or not you are in bounds. As long as I'm in bounds, then these array elements are really just, in this case, string variables. They're whatever your variable, your data type is in your array. So this team index 0 is really the same as player 1 was in my old version, and I can use it the same way. So anything I could do with the variable player 1, I could now do with team index 0. So I can print it out. We've seen that. I can change it. With an assignment statement, and that works just fine. So I'm trying to drive home the point here that once we have got some data and once we've created this array, the individual elements in that array are just variables. And you might not know them yet, but there are a whole bunch of string related methods and things we can do with strings that I can do with this team index 0, team index 1, any valid index. So we need to learn that this is really just a way of grouping individual variables together, and those individual variables are still usable as variables. All right, but Tim, come on, you said the whole point of this was to make our lives easier. This is actually worse because player 1 is probably easier to type than team bracket 0 bracket, right? So this is just making things much worse. Let's go ahead and comment out this code, and we'll show you the first shortcut you're going to learn with arrays, and that is something that we call an initialization list. So if we know what data we want to put into our array at the time we are creating it, we can just list that data and it will add that in at the time the program is executed. So I can say, I have to start over. I've commented out my team array, so it doesn't exist anymore. That's why I've got an error here. So let's recreate that. String team equals. Now, if I'm going to use an initializer list, I don't use the new keyword. Instead, I give it a block of code with curly braces, and I can just list my elements in with a comma separated list inside of this initialization. So Marie, it's hard for me to type and talk at the same time, but I want to get all these names. And here. And Vanessa. And then I need a semicolon at the end because this is a regular statement. And now if I run this code, okay, John and Marie, and that seems to be working fine. And now I think before I tried to access David's index and he wasn't in the array yet, so let's try that again. There we go. So this is our first shortcut with an array. You can see that now we are starting to potentially save some time and some effort using this initialization list. Now, a couple things about this. First of all, you can only use an initialization list when you first create the array. So I can't make an array called team and then use it for a little while and then go back and use an initialization list. It is intended to be used, it's allowed to be used only when you are creating the array for the first time. So that's important to know. What that means is that you can't make your array with an initialization list unless you know at the time you're making the array what all those values are. So in other words, for example, if you're getting the values from the user, they're typing them in, you can't use an initialization list, right? So we'll have some different tricks for that. The other thing I wanted to make clear here is that the only reason these are in quotation marks is because this array happens to be an array of string objects, right? So the quotation marks are related to these being strings. If we see an example of an array of a different data type, like a double, we'll make an array of prices, and I'm going to use an initialization list. I just write the doubles as I normally would write them, semicolon at the end, and that works just fine, right? But do not put quotation marks around them because now it's going to think they're strings, and that doesn't work. I cannot put a string into an array of doubles and vice versa. Once you declare the data type, just like you would with any other variable, you're locked into that and you can only use that kind of data with your array. Let me go ahead and fix that back to something that compiles. Now I'm going to say again that I'm going to drive home this point once again, that once we have put a value into an array, we can deal with that element just like any other variable. And I keep saying that because there seems to be sometimes a little tripping point for beginning programmers where they just make arrays more confusing than they need to be. Once you've put something in that array, I mean, you've been working with strings and doubles all along. This is no different. It's got this funny little syntax with the square brackets. So if I want to print out the prices, I'm going to change that to prices. And now 3, you might have noticed already, is not going to work, right? Because 0, 1, 2, the highest valid index is 2. So let's go ahead and just print out that first one. Okay, $1.99 makes sense. And if I want to manipulate that variable at all, now I'm even calling them variables, but that array element, I can do that. So let's just say prices 0 plus equals 50 cents, right? Inflation, we're going to add 50 cents onto our price. So try not to make these arrays more complicated than they need to be. Once something is in the array, this is just a double in this case, right? These are just strings, and I can use them the same way that I've been using doubles and strings all along, right? So I know I'm repetitive, but that really seems to be a stumbling block for students, where they get something into an array and all of a sudden their brain hangs up on, it's an array, now it's hard to work with. No, they're just variables. Once they're put into an array, it's just like binding all those variables together. All right, and one last point, I don't want to go through and demonstrate them all because it would never finish, but I can make my arrays out of any data type I want. So I can make an array of ints, I can make an array of characters, I can make an array of booleans, and then I can make an array of objects. And so we've actually already done that with strings, but with any object. And so in a separate video, we will explore that idea. But for now, this is the basic syntax for an array. And in fact, this is a really good place to stop this video, because I want you to take arrays in really small, easily digested pieces here. So what I would encourage you to do is stop at this point and just go try experimenting with these. Make some arrays, put some data in it, manipulate that data, get used to the idea that these really are just variables that are bundled together. If you have any questions, you can obviously reach out to me. And once you have the hang of that, you can move on to the next video.